And now we got to talk politics for a minute because Congress just released a huge report on COVID that once again makes many of the establishment class's actions during the pandemic look utterly indefensible. So after a 2-year investigation, a bipartisan group in Congress just released a comprehensive report into the coronavirus and in particular its origins that has some interesting tidbits in it. As Newsweek reports, after a 2-year congressional investigation into the COVID-19 pandemic, U.S. lawmakers are supporting the theory that the virus originated in a Chinese laboratory. So this is known as the lab leak theory. It's the idea that the whole pandemic got kicked off when the Wuhan lab leaked a virus, almost certainly unintentionally, that it had in its facilities, rather than the other original theory that was pushed, which was more of a natural origin, that it had spread from animals to humans at a wet market in Wuhan. Originally, the lab leak theory was over and over described as a fringe theory or a conspiracy theory. Some people were even smeared as racist for suggesting it, but as time has gone on, it looks more and more like it's actually what happened. On Monday, the Republican-led subcommittee set up to provide an after-action review of the pandemic published a report subtitled "The Lessons Learned and a Path Forward." Chief among the report's findings was that the virus, quote, likely emerged from a lab, with evidence suggesting that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was responsible. So this isn't an earth-shattering revelation because many other federal agencies, including the FBI, have already reached the conclusion that they think this is the most likely theory about what happened. But it adds more fuel to the fire, and we'll get into why this matters in just a sec. The subcommittee's report suggests that U.S. politicians on both sides of the aisle now support the lab leak theory. The congressional panel was convinced of the idea after meeting 25 times, conducting more than 30 transcribed interviews, and reviewing more than 1 million pages of documents. They also pointed out that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has some culpability for this accident. Additionally, WIV researchers probably did not use adequate biosafety precautions at least some of the time prior to the pandemic in handling SARS-like coronaviruses, the report added, citing an Office of the Director of National Intelligence assessment from June 2023. The reason this matters is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has been funded by US taxpayer dollars, but apparently was lax in their safety standards and likely had an accident that caused the pandemic that decimated the world and incredibly harmed the US in so many ways. That's not good, to say the least, and we absolutely should have some accountability for it. But the real reason that I wanted to discuss this story is because I worry that the insane way in which this theory was originally handled has been memory holed or forgotten. People who originally suggested that this might have happened were viciously attacked and smeared. One New York Times reporter even suggested that the theory was racist. Apoorva Mandavili at the time tweeted, "Someday we will stop talking about the lab leak theory and maybe even admit its racist roots. But alas, that day is not yet here." Oof. That's a tweet that aged like milk. But more broadly, mainstream media attacked as fringe and conspiratorial anybody who explored this theory early in the pandemic, like Republican Senator Tom Cotton. But few, if any, of those media outlets have really ever apologized for that or admitted how terribly wrong they got it. Some of them have gone on to do good reporting about the lab leak theory, but and move on to suggest that yes, it probably did happen, but they kind of just leave their old bad and unfair coverage in the rearview mirror and move on and act like it never happened, which is wrong. Facebook also had a policy where across the board, they were taking down content that suggested the lab leak theory was a possibility or was serious or should be pursued and censoring it because the science was settled and these were conspiracy theories. And apparently that policy was at least influenced by direct pressure from the Biden White House pressuring the company to take down this speech, which, by the way, guys, is supposed to be protected by the First Amendment. And now this theory that they all dismissed as a conspiracy and tried to censor and smear at people who promoted it as racist or conspiracy-brained or whatever is the leading theory about what happened in the pandemic. And to me, that's a really, really important change and shift to take note of, because it reminds us why banning misinformation or censoring conspiracy theories is such a bad idea. because yesterday's misinformation is sometimes learned and discovered to be tomorrow's truth, but only when you have an open conversation and discourse. And yes, sometimes actual fake news or actual baseless conspiracies will spread as a result, but it's exponentially better to have that open debate and free flow than it is to trust the experts or really just the people in power at these big institutions and companies to decide the limits of the discourse, to decide which scientific theories are legitimate and which are not, because that's always going to be done politically and it's always going to be done poorly because nobody can be trusted with that kind of centralized power and authority. If they had been successful in shutting down this discourse completely, they weren't, thankfully, we never would have had this important realization about the true nature of the pandemic, and that means we wouldn't have been able to take accountability or prevent it from happening again in the future if we didn't even understand what really likely caused it. That's actually quite bad, and that would have been a direct result of the culture and push to crack down on misinformation or conspiracy theories that is still really widely embodied and defended by much of big tech, much of the mainstream media, and much of democratic politics. Many of them haven't learned their lesson, and that's a real problem.